The washing machine started making that grinding noise again at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I figured God was testing my patience with appliances the same way he'd been testing it with my wife for the past 6 months. Tessa had been spending more time at her prayer group than she did at home, and frankly, I was starting to think the Almighty had better conversation skills than I did. I was elbow deep in soapy water, trying to fish out whatever sock had decided to commit mechanical sabotage when I heard her voice drifting down from our bedroom. At first, I thought she was talking to her mother. Ruth had a habit of calling at ungodly hours to discuss the state of everyone's soul except her own. But then I caught fragments that made my wrench slip. "It's done, Damon. I told him God wants me to leave." I froze, water dripping from my hands onto the basement floor. Damon. Not her mother, not her sister. Damon, the prayer group leader she'd been gushing about for months like he was some combination of Billy Graham and Dr. Phil. "I'll be free by next week," she continued, her voice carrying that dreamy quality it got whenever she talked about her spiritual awakening. "Yes, I want the ceremony. I understand it's God's will." If God wanted her to leave, I thought, he could have at least left me a note, or a warning, or a bottle of Jack Daniels. I crept up the basement stairs, each step a careful negotiation with our ancient house's tendency to announce every movement with creaks and groans. The bedroom door was cracked open, and through the gap I could see Tessa sitting on our bed, the bed I'd been sleeping in alone more nights than not lately, with a phone pressed to her ear. Not her regular phone, a small, cheap flip phone I'd never seen before. "I know it's hard to understand," she was saying, "but when God reveals your true spiritual husband, you have to follow his guidance. Julian will understand eventually. He's a good man, but he's not my divine match." Divine match. Spiritual husband. The words hit me like a wrench to the gut. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. 3 months ago, Tessa had been a normal woman with a normal job in human resources at the county office. She complained about her boss, watched reality TV, and occasionally dragged me to Sunday service at the Methodist church, where we'd been married 8 years earlier. Then she'd found this prayer group through a flyer at the grocery store, and suddenly, she was speaking in tongues about divine revelations and spiritual callings. "The compound is beautiful," she whispered into the phone. "The other wives are so welcoming. They understand what it means to be chosen." Other wives. My hands started shaking. I made it back to the basement before my legs gave out, collapsing onto the concrete step beside my toolbox. The washing machine kept rumbling, but I barely heard it over the pounding in my ears. My wife of 8 years was planning to leave me for some so-called spiritual leader who seemed to collect women like trophies. The next morning, Tessa made pancakes. She hummed while she cooked, the same hymn she'd been humming for weeks. Amazing Grace. Though she only seemed to know the first verse and kept repeating it like a broken record. She was dressed for work in her conservative navy suit, her brown hair pulled back in the neat bun she'd adopted since joining the group. Gone were the days of her wearing jeans and letting her hair fall loose around her shoulders. "Julian, honey," she said, setting a plate in front of me with the kind of gentle smile you'd give a child. "We need to talk tonight. I have something important to share with you." I looked at the perfectly round pancakes, the butter melting in precise pats, the syrup drizzled in an artistic pattern. Everything about the scene screamed last meal before execution. "Sure," I managed. "Looking forward to it." She kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt more like a blessing than affection, and headed for the door. "I'll be home by 6. I'm making your favorite pot roast." After she left, I sat in our kitchen for another 20 minutes, staring at pancakes I couldn't eat. Our house felt different now, like a movie set waiting for the cameras to roll on the final scene. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the distance, our neighbor Barb was probably already positioning herself on her front porch, with her coffee and her gossip radar. I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in 3 years, and spent the morning going through our finances. What I found made the pancakes in my stomach turn to concrete. $127,000 gone, transferred in increments over the past 4 months to something called Divine Path Ministries. The withdrawal receipts were all signed with Tessa's neat handwriting, church tithes written in the memo line of each one. Our savings account, which had taken us 6 years to build, was down to $3,400. The money we'd been setting aside for a down payment on a better house, for the kids we'd talked about having someday, for the future we'd planned together, all of it funneled into Damon's Divine Revelation Fund. I found the flip phone in her jewelry box, hidden beneath the pearl necklace her grandmother had left her. The text message history read like a manual for cult recruitment. God has shown me your true purpose, Tessa. You were meant for something greater than your current life. The other wives are eager to welcome you into our spiritual family. You'll find the peace you've been searching for. Your husband is a good man, but he cannot understand divine calling. When you're ready, God will provide the words to help him release you with love. The ceremony will bind us in holy matrimony as God intended. Prepare your heart for true spiritual union. I scrolled through months of messages, each one more manipulative than the last. Damon had studied my wife like a scientist, identifying every insecurity, every spiritual longing, every crack in our marriage that he could wedge open with his divine crowbar. The final message was from yesterday. Tomorrow night, tell him gently, remember, this is God's will, not yours. He cannot argue with the Almighty. By the time Tessa came home with grocery bags full of pot roast ingredients, I had made copies of everything. The bank statements, the text messages, the receipts. I'd also done some research on Divine Path Ministries and its charismatic leader, Damon Vossel. What I found wasn't encouraging. Damon had started his ministry 2 years ago in our small Missouri town, purchasing a 40-acre compound outside the city limits with cash. No mortgage, no paper trail. The property featured a main house, several smaller buildings, and enough privacy to conduct whatever spiritual ceremonies he had in mind without interference from neighbors or local authorities. The ministry wasn't registered with the state as a religious organization. It wasn't registered as anything, actually. Damon Vossel had no credentials, no theological training, and no history in our town before his sudden appearance. What he did have was a talent for attracting married women who felt unfulfilled in their current lives. I watched Tessa prepare dinner with the same methodical care she'd shown that morning. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, like she was following a script. When she caught me staring, she smiled that same gentle, pitying smile. "You look tired, honey. Are you feeling all right?" "Just thinking," I said. "About us, about where we're headed." Her hands stilled on the cutting board. "That's actually perfect timing. We really do need to discuss our future." We ate dinner in relative silence, the pot roast tasting like cardboard in my mouth. Tessa made small talk about her day at work, about the weather, about everything except the elephant in the room. Finally, she set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. "Julian, I need you to know that I love you. I've always loved you, and I always will. But love isn't always enough to fulfill God's plan for our lives." Here it comes, I thought. The divine revelation speech. Over the past few months, through prayer and spiritual guidance, God has revealed some difficult truths to me about my purpose, about the path He wants me to follow. She paused, her eyes focused somewhere beyond my shoulder. "He's shown me that while you're a wonderful man, you're not my spiritual husband, my divine match." I set down my own fork, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "And I suppose He's revealed who this spiritual husband is?" "Damon has been chosen to guide me on my spiritual journey. God has shown both of us that we're meant to be joined in holy matrimony, to serve His purpose together." "Holy matrimony? While you're still married to me?" She flinched slightly. "Marriage is a legal construct, Julian. What Damon and I have is blessed by God Himself. It transcends earthly institutions. How convenient. And I suppose God also revealed that this spiritual marriage requires our life savings? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. The ministry requires support. We all contribute according to our means. All? How many wives does this spiritual husband of yours have? We're a spiritual family. The other women understand. Other women. I leaned back in my chair. How many, Tessa? She lifted her chin, defiance replacing uncertainty. 6, 7, when I joined them. We're all called to serve God's purpose through Damon's guidance. 7 wives. Our entire savings account. A compound in the middle of nowhere. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. I'm filing for divorce, she continued, her voice steady again. I've already spoken with an attorney. This doesn't have to be ugly, Julian. We can part with love and understanding. God doesn't want us to suffer unnecessarily. I stared at my wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, and felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. She'd planned this entire conversation, rehearsed every word, probably with input from her spiritual husband. She'd drained our accounts, planned our divorce, and arranged her new life without once considering that I might have something to say about it. When? I asked. When what? When is this spiritual wedding supposed to happen? She hesitated. This weekend, Saturday night. It's a beautiful ceremony, Julian. Very meaningful. 3 days. She was giving me 3 days' notice that she was leaving our 8-year marriage for a polygamist cult leader who'd convinced her that God wanted her to hand over our life savings and become wife number 7. I see. I stood up, gathering the dinner plates with steady hands. Well, I appreciate you letting me know. She blinked, clearly expecting more of a fight. You're taking this very well. I'm taking it exactly as well as it deserves, I said, carrying the dishes to the sink. If God wants you gone, I'm not going to argue with the Almighty. That night, while Tessa slept peacefully beside me for what would be one of the last times, I lay awake, making plans. She thought she was following divine guidance, but I knew manipulation when I saw it. Damon Vossel had targeted my wife, isolated her from friends and family, convinced her to drain our accounts, and now he was preparing to add her to his collection. The old Julian would have tried to talk sense into her, would have begged her to reconsider, would have fought for our marriage with words and tears and desperate pleas. But the old Julian hadn't known about the other wives, or the missing money, or the compound where his wife had been spending her Thursday through Sunday nights for the past 2 months. The new Julian had a different plan entirely. If Damon wanted to play God with people's lives, I was going to introduce him to some Old Testament justice. And if Tessa wanted to follow divine revelations, she was about to discover that sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he works through pissed-off husbands with nothing left to lose. I reached for my laptop and started researching everything I could find about Damon Vossel, Divine Path Ministries, and the fine art of destroying a cult leader's life without breaking any laws. It was going to be a long night, but I had a feeling it would be worth it. The next morning, Tessa left for work with the same serene smile she'd been wearing for months, like she'd swallowed a particularly potent antidepressant. She kissed my cheek at the door, another blessing rather than affection, and reminded me that she'd be at group until Sunday evening. Group was her euphemism for the compound. I'd learned to decode her language over the past few months. Group meant Thursday through Sunday at Damon's property. Prayer time meant private conversations with her spiritual husband. Spiritual guidance meant whatever manipulation Damon was feeding her that week. After her car disappeared down our street, I called my boss and took another sick day. Then I drove to the county clerk's office to do some research on Divine Path Ministries and its mysterious leader. The clerk, a woman named Janet, who'd gone to high school with my younger sister, was happy to help once I explained I was doing background research for a potential business partnership. Small towns run on information, and Janet had plenty to share. That compound's been the talk of the office, she said, pulling up property records on her computer. 40 acres purchased 2 years ago for cash. No mortgage, no liens. The buyer was listed as Damon Vossel, but the paperwork was handled by a law firm out of Kansas City. What about business licenses? Religious organization status? Janet shook her head. Nothing registered locally. No business license, no tax-exempt status, no incorporation papers. As far as the county's concerned, it's just a private residence. She pulled up the satellite view of the property on her screen. The main house was large, probably 4,000 square feet, with several smaller buildings scattered around it. A long driveway wound through trees to a gate at the main road. The whole setup was designed for privacy. Strange thing is, Janet continued, lowering her voice, we've had 3 other women come in asking about the same property. All married, all asking the same kinds of questions you are. Makes you wonder what's really going on out there. I thanked Janet and drove to the public library, where I spent the next 4 hours digging deeper into Damon Vossel's background. What I found was disturbing but not surprising. Damon Vossel didn't exist before 2 years ago. No credit history, no employment records, no educational background. The name was as manufactured as his ministry. But the law firm that had handled his property purchase had left a paper trail, and that trail led to some interesting discoveries. The firm had previously represented a Marcus Trenner, a licensed therapist from Kansas who'd had his credentials revoked 3 years ago for inappropriate relationships with vulnerable female clients. Marcus had also been the subject of 2 restraining orders filed by former patients who accused him of manipulating them into leaving their husbands. Marcus Trenner had disappeared from Kansas around the same time Damon Vossel had appeared in Missouri. Coincidence seemed unlikely. I printed everything I could find and drove home to continue my research. By evening, I had built a comprehensive profile of the man who was stealing my wife. Marcus Trenner, aka Damon Vossel, was 42 years old and had a history of targeting married women experiencing life transitions or emotional difficulties. His therapeutic license had been revoked after multiple complaints of boundary violations, including attempts to convince female patients that their marriages were spiritually unfulfilling and that he could provide better guidance for their lives. The restraining orders painted a clear picture. Marcus would identify vulnerable women, isolate them from their support systems, convince them that he understood their spiritual needs better than their husbands, and gradually manipulate them into leaving their marriages. The religious angle was new, but the pattern was identical. What worried me most was what had happened to his previous victims. According to court records, both women who'd filed restraining orders had suffered complete financial ruin. One had lost custody of her children after her ex-husband proved she'd been manipulated into draining their accounts. The other had been hospitalized for malnutrition and dehydration after living in what investigators described as cult-like conditions. My wife was walking into a trap that had been carefully constructed by a predator with years of experience. That evening I drove out to the compound. I didn't have a plan beyond seeing the place for myself, but I needed to understand the environment where Tessa had been spending half her time. The property was exactly as isolated as the satellite photos had suggested. The main road was barely 2 lanes, winding through farmland and forest with no streetlights or nearby houses. The compound's entrance was marked by a simple wooden sign, Divine Path Ministries, private property. The gate was wrought iron, tall enough to discourage casual visitors, with a security camera mounted on the post. I parked across the road and watched for 20 minutes. 3 cars were visible through the gate, a black Mercedes sedan, a white Honda Accord, and a blue Ford pickup. Lights were on in the main house and 2 of the smaller buildings. It looked peaceful, almost pastoral, which somehow made it more sinister. As I was preparing to leave, the gate opened and the Mercedes pulled out. Even in the dim light, I could see the driver was a man with dark hair and a beard. Damon Vossel, presumably, heading out for evening recruitment activities. I followed at a distance, curious about where a cult leader spent his Thursday nights. The answer was disappointing. He drove to a chain restaurant near the mall, where he met with a woman I didn't recognize. She was maybe 35, well-dressed, with the kind of tired expression that suggested life hadn't been going according to plan lately. I parked where I could watch their table through the window. Damon was in full performance mode, leaning forward with intense eye contact, gesturing expressively as he spoke. The woman hung on every word, nodding and occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Classic predator behavior: find the vulnerability, offer understanding, promise solutions. The woman left first, looking dazed but hopeful. Damon sat alone for a few minutes, making notes in a small notebook. Then he paid the check and drove back toward the compound. I followed again, but this time I didn't stop at the gate. I continued past the property, looking for another way to observe the compound from a different angle. About a mile down the road, I found a dirt track that led into the woods. I parked and walked back through the trees until I had a clear view of the rear of the property. What I saw made my stomach turn. Behind the main house was a large garden area where several women were working despite the late hour. They moved with the mechanical precision of people following a strict routine, weeding and watering by the light of flood lamps. Even from a distance, I could see they were all dressed identically: long skirts, modest blouses, hair covered with scarves. One of them was Tessa, my wife, who had never shown any interest in gardening during our 8 years of marriage, was on her hands and knees pulling weeds at 9 p.m. like some kind of agricultural automaton. She looked thinner than she had a few months ago, and there was something about her posture that suggested exhaustion. I watched for another hour as the women completed their garden work and filed into one of the smaller buildings. Lights went out systematically, first the garden floods, then the main house, finally, the smaller buildings. By 11 p.m., the compound was dark except for security lighting. I made my way back to my car, my mind racing with questions. Why were the women doing manual labor so late at night? Why did they all dress the same? And why did my wife look like she'd lost 20 pounds? The drive home gave me time to think, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I had the beginnings of a plan. Tessa thought she was following God's will, but she was actually following a script written by a manipulative predator. If I could expose Damon's true identity and methods, maybe I could save not just my wife, but all the women he was exploiting. The problem was evidence. I needed proof of what was happening at the compound, documentation of Damon's real identity, and some way to demonstrate that his divine revelations were actually calculated manipulation. I spent the weekend alone in our house, researching and planning while Tessa attended her spiritual wedding to a man who collected wives like trophies. By Sunday evening, when she returned home glowing with post-ceremony bliss, I was ready to begin phase 1 of my counterattack. "How was group?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Wonderful," she said, settling onto the couch with the kind of satisfied smile people get after a particularly good meal. The ceremony was beautiful, very meaningful. I feel so blessed to be part of God's plan. "I'm happy you're finding fulfillment," I said, and I almost meant it. She looked genuinely content, which made what I was planning feel both necessary and cruel. "Julian, I want you to know that even though our earthly marriage is ending, I'll always care about you. Damon says that God wants us to part with love, not bitterness." Damon sounds like a wise man. I'd like to meet him sometime. Tessa blinked in surprise. "Really? You'd want to meet him? If he's going to be such an important part of your life, it seems appropriate. Maybe he could help me understand God's plan for my own future." That's wonderful, Julian. I'll ask him about arranging a meeting." "I'd appreciate that. In the meantime, I've been doing some thinking about our situation. About the finances, the house, all the practical details." Her expression grew cautious. "What kind of thinking?" "Well, if God wants you to follow a different path, I don't want to hold you back with earthly concerns. I've been looking into how we can handle the divorce as smoothly as possible." Relief flooded her face. "Oh, Julian, that's so generous of you. I was worried you might make things difficult." "No point in fighting divine will," I said. "Though I do have some questions about the financial arrangements, for my own planning purposes." "Of course. What do you need to know?" "The money that went to the ministry, was that a one-time contribution, or will there be ongoing financial obligations?" "Damon says that God provides for those who serve his purpose. The ministry supports all of us according to our needs." "That's reassuring. And the other wives, are they all in similar situations? Divorced from their previous husbands?" "Most of them, yes. It's not easy to follow God's calling when you're tied to earthly marriages that don't serve his purpose. I imagine their ex-husbands weren't as understanding as I'm trying to be." Tessa's smile faltered slightly. "Some people have difficulty accepting divine guidance. It's sad, really. They choose bitterness over acceptance." "Well, I'm choosing acceptance. In fact, I'm wondering if there's some way I could contribute to the ministry myself, as a gesture of goodwill." "You'd do that?" "If it would help you and the other wives find the spiritual fulfillment you're seeking, yes. Maybe Damon could advise me on what kind of contribution would be most meaningful." "I'll definitely ask him. He'll be so pleased to know you're approaching this with such an open heart." Open heart, I thought. If only she knew how open my heart was to the possibility of destroying her spiritual husband's carefully constructed little empire. "There is one other thing," I said casually. "I've been curious about the compound. It sounds like such a peaceful place. Would it be possible for me to visit sometime, just to see where you'll be living?" I'd have to ask Damon about that. The property is very private. We don't usually have outside visitors." "Of course, I understand the need for privacy during spiritual work. But maybe if Damon and I meet first, and he feels comfortable with my intentions." "Maybe," she said, but her tone suggested doubt. "The ministry has to be very careful about maintaining the right spiritual environment." "Absolutely. I wouldn't want to disrupt anything important." That night, Tessa called Damon on her regular phone. Apparently, the burner was only for secret communications. I listened from the hallway as she explained my unexpected cooperation and my request to meet with him. "He seems very accepting of God's plan," she said. "He even wants to contribute to the ministry." Yes, I was surprised too. He asked about visiting the compound, but I told him that would be up to you. There was a long pause as she listened to Damon's response. "I understand. Yes, I'll tell him you'd be happy to meet with him. Thursday evening would be perfect. The restaurant by the mall? I'll let him know." After she hung up, she came to find me in the living room. "Good news," she said. "Damon would like to meet with you Thursday evening. He's impressed by your mature response to this situation. I'm looking forward to it. Where should we meet?" "That family restaurant by the mall, 7 o'clock. He said to look for a man with dark hair and a beard wearing a blue shirt." "Perfect. I'll be there." As Tessa headed upstairs to bed, I allowed myself a small smile. Phase 1 was working exactly as planned. Damon thought he was dealing with a compliant husband who'd accepted defeat gracefully. He had no idea he was about to sit down with someone who knew his real name, his criminal history, and his methods. Thursday evening couldn't come fast enough. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of unseasonable warmth that makes Missouri weather forecasters throw up their hands in defeat. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Damon. Khakis, polo shirt, the kind of outfit that suggested a man who'd accepted his fate with middle-class resignation. I wanted to look harmless, defeated, maybe a little pathetic. The restaurant was one of those family chains that tries to be everything to everyone. Sports bar, family dining, casual date night venue. and succeeds at being aggressively mediocre. Perfect territory for a cult leader who needed to blend in while conducting recruitment interviews. I arrived 15 minutes early and positioned myself at a corner table where I could watch the entrance. At exactly 7 o'clock, a man matching Tessa's description walked through the door. Dark hair, neatly trimmed beard, blue shirt, and the kind of confident posture that suggested he owned whatever room he entered. Marcus Trenner looked exactly like his therapist license photo, just with more facial hair and an extra layer of manufactured spirituality in his expression. He scanned the restaurant with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing environments and people, then walked directly to my table. "Julian?" His voice was warm, concerned, with just a hint of authority, the perfect tone for delivering life-changing revelations. "I'm Damon. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Thank you for making time," I said, standing to shake his hand. His grip was firm, held just a moment too long, a dominance display disguised as warmth. "Please sit. I know this situation must be difficult for you." "It's been an adjustment," I admitted, settling back into my chair. "But Tessa seems so happy, so fulfilled. I want to understand what's brought her such peace." Damon smiled, the expression reaching his eyes with practiced sincerity. "Tessa is a remarkable woman. Her spiritual sensitivity, her openness to divine guidance, it's truly inspiring. You should be proud of the woman you helped nurture." "I am proud of her. That's why I want to make sure I handle this transition properly. I don't want my own limitations to interfere with God's plan for her life." "That's very mature of you, Julian. Many men in your situation react with anger, possessiveness. They can't see beyond their own earthly attachments." "Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, about marriage, about purpose, about what it really means to love someone." The waitress appeared, and we ordered coffee. Damon used the interruption to study me more carefully, probably assessing whether I was genuinely compliant or potentially problematic. "Tessa mentioned you might be interested in contributing to our ministry," he said, once we were alone again. "I've been considering it. If I can't be part of her spiritual journey directly, maybe I can support it in other ways." "What kind of contribution did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure. I was hoping you could guide me. What does the ministry need most right now?" Damon leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Our work requires significant resources. The compound, the programs we offer, the support we provide to the families in our care, it all requires financial backing. Most of our members contribute according to their means, but there's always more we could do with additional support." "The compound sounds fascinating. Tessa describes it as such a peaceful place." "It is. We've worked hard to create an environment where people can focus on spiritual growth without the distractions of the modern world. Simple living, meaningful work, genuine community. I'd love to see it sometime, just to understand where Tessa will be living." His smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "The compound is very private, Julian. We maintain strict boundaries to preserve the spiritual atmosphere. Outside visitors can disrupt the energy we've worked so hard to cultivate." "I understand completely. I wouldn't want to interfere with anything important. I appreciate your respect for our practices. Perhaps in time, as you develop your own spiritual understanding, a visit might be possible." "That would be wonderful. In the meantime, I'm curious about the other families in your ministry. Are there other husbands who've gone through similar transitions?" "Each situation is unique," Damon said carefully. "God calls people to different paths. Some marriages are meant to evolve, others to transform completely. The important thing is remaining open to divine guidance." "Have you found that most husbands are as accepting as I'm trying to be?" "Unfortunately, no. Many men struggle with ego, with the need to control. They see their wives' spiritual growth as a threat rather than a blessing. That must make things difficult for everyone involved. It can be challenging. But God provides strength for those who trust in His plan." Our coffee arrived, giving me a moment to consider my next move. Damon was being careful, revealing nothing specific about his operation while probing for information about my intentions and resources. Classic manipulation. Gather intelligence while offering vague promises and spiritual platitudes. "I have to ask," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "How do you know when God is revealing these things to you? I mean, how can you be certain it's divine guidance and not just human interpretation?" Damon's eyes lit up. This was clearly a question he enjoyed answering. "That's an excellent question, Julian. It speaks to your spiritual sincerity. Divine revelation isn't something that happens overnight. It requires prayer, meditation, careful discernment. Over the years, I've developed a sensitivity to God's voice that allows me to recognize His guidance even when it challenges conventional thinking." Years of training? Did you study theology somewhere? My education has been primarily experiential. God has been my teacher, life, my classroom. I've found that traditional theological training can actually interfere with pure spiritual receptivity. Interesting? So you've never been formally ordained or certified? Ordination is a human institution, Julian. God doesn't require credentials to speak through His chosen vessels. Of course, I didn't mean to question your authority. I'm just trying to understand how divine guidance works. No offense taken. Skepticism is healthy, as long as it doesn't close us off to spiritual truth. I nodded thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something personal, about your own spiritual journey?" "Certainly. Have you always known you were called to this kind of ministry, or was there a specific moment when God revealed your purpose?" Damon was quiet for a moment, probably deciding how much of his manufactured backstory to share. "I spent many years searching for my true calling. I worked in various fields, always feeling like something was missing. Then, about 3 years ago, I had a profound spiritual experience that changed everything. God showed me that I was meant to guide others who were struggling with similar questions about purpose and fulfillment. 3 years ago, that must have been quite a transformation. It was. I left my old life behind completely, my career, my location, everything that was keeping me from serving God's purpose." "What kind of career were you leaving behind?" Another pause. "I worked in counseling, helping people, but within the limitations of secular psychology. God showed me that true healing requires spiritual guidance, not just therapeutic techniques." Bingo. He'd just admitted to his background in therapy, probably testing whether I'd make any connections. Time to seem impressed rather than suspicious. "That makes perfect sense. You must have learned so much about human nature in that work. It probably helps you understand what people need spiritually." "Exactly. My previous experience taught me to recognize the signs of spiritual hunger, the symptoms of lives that aren't aligned with divine purpose. Like with Tessa, you recognized that she needed something different. Tessa's spiritual sensitivity was obvious from our first conversation. She was clearly meant for something greater than her current circumstances allowed. I'm grateful you were able to help her find that path, even if it means our marriage has to end." "You're handling this with remarkable grace, Julian. Many men would be bitter, angry. Your willingness to put Tessa's spiritual needs above your own desires shows real maturity." "I love her. I want her to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me. That's true love. Selfless, unconditional. God sees your sacrifice and will bless you for it." We talked for another hour, with Damon gradually relaxing as he became convinced I posed no threat to his operation. He shared carefully edited stories about the other wives, described the compound's daily routines in vague terms, and hinted at the spiritual ceremonies that bound the community together. By the end of the evening, I had confirmed everything I'd suspected and gathered several new pieces of information. Damon was definitely Marcus Trenner, operating under a manufactured identity. He was running a classic cult operation: isolation, financial exploitation, psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance. and he was completely convinced that I was a harmless, defeated husband who would cause no problems. "I hope we can meet again soon," he said as we prepared to leave. "I'd like to help you find your own spiritual path through this transition. I'd appreciate that. And please let me know if there's any way I can support the ministry. I meant what I said about wanting to contribute. I'll certainly keep that in mind. God may have plans for you that neither of us can see yet." We shook hands again, and I watched him walk to his Mercedes. As he drove away, probably heading back to his compound full of manipulated women, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 was complete. I'd established contact, confirmed his identity, and convinced him I wasn't a threat. Now it was time for Phase 2, gathering evidence that would expose his operation and save my wife from making the biggest mistake of her life. I drove home planning my next moves. Tessa would want to know how the meeting went, and I needed to maintain my cover as the compliant, spiritually seeking ex-husband. Meanwhile, I'd begin building the case that would bring down Damon Vossel and rescue the women he was exploiting. It was going to be a delicate balance, appearing cooperative while secretly working to destroy everything he'd built. But after tonight, I was confident I could pull it off. Marcus Trenner had made a career of manipulating people, but he'd never dealt with someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. That was about to change. The morning after my meeting with Damon, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally having a concrete enemy to fight. For months, I'd been battling shadows, Tessa's spiritual awakening, her emotional distance, the gradual dissolution of our marriage. Now I had a target, Marcus Trenner, fake prophet and professional wife-stealer. Tessa was already gone when I got up, having left early for what she called morning devotions at the compound. She'd be there until Sunday evening, giving me 3 days to advance my investigation without having to maintain the facade of the understanding husband. I called in sick again. My boss was going to start asking questions soon, but that was a problem for future Julian. Present Julian had more important work to do. My first stop was the sheriff's office. Our county sheriff, Maggie Doyle, had been 2 years ahead of me in high school and had a reputation for being both competent and skeptical of anything that seemed too good to be true. If anyone would listen to concerns about a religious compound operating without proper oversight, it would be Maggie. The sheriff's office occupied a converted house on Main Street, all wood paneling and fluorescent lights that had probably been installed during the Carter administration. Maggie was at her desk, reviewing reports, with the kind of focused attention that suggested actual crime was rare enough in our county to merit careful consideration. "Julian Kepler," she said, looking up as I approached her desk. "Haven't seen you since the class reunion. How's Tessa?" "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I think she might be in trouble." Maggie gestured to the chair across from her desk. "What kind of trouble?" I gave her the condensed version: Tessa's involvement with Divine Path Ministries, the missing money, Damon's background as Marcus Trenner, and my growing concerns about what was happening at the compound. "So you're telling me," Maggie said when I finished, "that your wife joined a religious group, gave them your savings, and is now planning to divorce you to marry the leader? When you put it like that, it sounds like a domestic dispute. But this isn't about my marriage, Maggie. This guy is running a systematic operation. Multiple wives, financial exploitation, psychological manipulation. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better." "What kind of worse?" "I don't know yet. But men like Marcus Trenner don't stop at stealing money and breaking up marriages. They escalate. They get more controlling, more isolated, more dangerous." Maggie leaned back in her chair. "Julian, I understand you're upset about your marriage. Anyone would be. But what you're describing, most of it's not illegal. Adults can give their money to whatever organization they want. They can leave their spouses for whoever they want. Even if this Damon character is manipulative, that's not necessarily a crime. What about operating under a false identity? What about the unlicensed therapy practice he was running in Kansas? Different state, different jurisdiction. And if he's not practicing therapy here, that's not our concern. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, containing copies of everything I'd found about Marcus Trenner's background. At least look at this. The pattern of behavior, the financial exploitation, the isolation tactics. This isn't just a religious group, Maggie. It's a cult. She took the folder and flipped through it, her expression growing more serious as she read. This is concerning, she admitted. But it's also circumstantial. I can't launch an investigation based on suspicions and out-of-state court records. What would you need to take action? Evidence of a crime being committed in my jurisdiction, financial fraud, physical abuse, unlawful imprisonment, something concrete. And if I could get that evidence, then we'd have something to work with. But Julian, be careful how you go about this. If you're wrong about this guy, you could be looking at harassment charges. And if you're right, she paused. If you're right, he's not going to appreciate you digging into his business. I left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated, but not defeated. Maggie's hands were tied by legal constraints, but she'd essentially given me permission to gather evidence as long as I stayed within the law. Now I needed to figure out how to do that without tipping off Damon or endangering Tessa. My next stop was the public library, where I spent several hours researching cult deprogramming techniques and legal strategies for exposing fraudulent religious organizations. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The encouraging part: cults follow predictable patterns, and those patterns leave evidence trails. Financial records, communication logs, witness testimonies, all of it could be used to build a case for fraud or abuse. The terrifying part: cult leaders who feel threatened often escalate their control tactics. They might relocate their operations, increase isolation of their followers, or even resort to violence to protect their power structure. I was walking a tightrope. Move too slowly, and more women would be victimized. Move too quickly, and I might trigger a response that put everyone in danger. That evening, I drove back to the compound, not to confront anyone or attempt another break-in, but to observe and document. I parked in the same wooded area I'd used before and settled in to watch the evening routines. What I saw was more disturbing than my previous visit. The women were working in the garden again, but this time I could see that some of them looked unwell. One woman, I thought it might be the blonde I'd seen at the restaurant with Damon, was moving slowly, as if she were in pain or exhaustion. Another kept stopping to rest, sitting heavily on the ground before forcing herself back to her feet. Tessa was among them, and she looked worse than she had the week before, thinner, more tired, with the kind of mechanical movements that suggested she was operating on autopilot rather than conscious choice. Around 10 p.m., the women finished their work and filed into the main house. Through the windows, I could see them gathering in what appeared to be a large living room. Damon stood at the front of the group, gesturing as he spoke. Even from a distance, his body language suggested he was delivering some kind of lecture or sermon. I watched for 2 hours, taking notes and photos with my phone's camera. The women sat motionless throughout Damon's presentation, occasionally nodding or raising their hands in response to questions I couldn't hear. It looked less like a religious service and more like a training session. Finally, the women dispersed to different parts of the house while Damon remained in the living room with 3 men I hadn't seen before. They appeared to be discussing something serious, with frequent gestures toward papers spread on a table. I was preparing to leave when I noticed movement in one of the smaller buildings. A light came on in what appeared to be an office, and I could see someone moving around inside. After a few minutes, the person came to the window. It was Damon, and he was talking on a phone. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. Even though I couldn't hear anything, Damon's body language suggested he was agitated about something. He paced, gestured emphatically, and at one point appeared to be arguing with whoever was on the other end of the call. When the call ended, he sat at a desk and began writing in what looked like a ledger or journal. He worked for another hour before turning off the light and heading back to the main house. I made my way back to my car, mind racing with questions. Who had Damon been talking to? What had upset him? And what was he recording in that journal? The next morning, I decided to take a more direct approach. I called the compound's main number, listed in the phone book under Divine Path Ministries, and asked to speak with Damon. "This is Julian Kepler," I said when he came on the line. "I wanted to thank you again for meeting with me Thursday night. It really helped me understand what Tessa is going through." "I'm glad it was helpful, Julian. How are you feeling about everything?" "Better, actually. I've been praying about it, and I think God is showing me that this transition might be part of His plan for my life, too." "That's wonderful to hear. Spiritual growth often comes through difficult circumstances. I was wondering if we could meet again soon. I have some specific questions about how I might contribute to the ministry, and I'd like to discuss my own spiritual development." "Of course. When would be convenient for you?" "Actually, I was hoping I might be able to visit the compound. I know you mentioned it's private, but I feel like I need to see where Tessa is finding so much peace. It might help me accept this transition more completely." There was a long pause. "Julian, I appreciate your spiritual sincerity, but the compound really isn't appropriate for outside visitors. The energy we maintain there is very delicate." "I understand, but maybe just a brief visit? I promise not to disrupt anything. I just want to see where my wife is going to be living." "Let me think about it. Perhaps we could arrange something very limited, under the right circumstances." "That would mean so much to me. And I've been thinking about the contribution I mentioned. I have some life insurance money from my father's passing last year, about $15,000. I'd like to donate it to the ministry." Another pause, longer this time. "That's very generous, Julian. Let me discuss the visitation possibility with the other members of our leadership council. Can I call you back tomorrow?" "Absolutely. And Damon, thank you for being so patient with me. I know this situation hasn't been easy for anyone. God calls us to show compassion during times of transition. I'm pleased to see you're opening your heart to His guidance." After hanging up, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The mention of money had definitely gotten his attention, and the request for a compound visit had him thinking. Now I needed to prepare for whatever response he came up with. That afternoon, I drove to the nearest electronics store and purchased a small digital recorder, a GPS tracker, and a prepaid cell phone. If I was going to gather evidence, I needed the right tools. I also stopped by Mike's bar to bring my best friend up to speed on what was happening. Mike had been my drinking buddy since college, and while he wasn't the brightest guy in the world, he was loyal and had a useful background in amateur boxing. "So let me get this straight," Mike said, polishing a glass with the kind of methodical attention that suggested he was thinking hard. "Your wife joined a cult, gave them all your money, and is planning to marry the leader? That's the simplified version, yeah? And you're planning to take this guy down how exactly?" "Carefully, legally, with evidence and documentation." "Uh-huh. And what happens when he figures out what you're doing?" "That's where I might need backup. Nothing violent," I added quickly, seeing Mike's expression brighten. "Just someone watching my back while I gather information." "I can do that. This Damon character sounds like he needs an attitude adjustment." "Mike, I'm serious about the no violence thing. If this goes wrong, I don't want anyone getting hurt or arrested." "Relax. I'll be the picture of restraint. But if this guy tries anything stupid, then we call the sheriff and let the law handle it." Mike nodded, but I could see he was already imagining scenarios that involved more direct action. I made a mental note to keep him away from any actual confrontations with Damon. That evening, Tessa called to check in. She sounded tired but happy, with that dreamy quality her voice had developed since joining the group. "How are things at home?" she asked. "Quiet. I've been doing a lot of thinking, like I mentioned. Actually, I talked to Damon today about possibly visiting the compound." You did? What did he say? He's going to discuss it with the leadership council. I hope it works out. I really want to understand the environment where you're finding so much spiritual fulfillment. Oh, Julian, it would be wonderful if you could see it. The peace here, the sense of community. It's everything I've been searching for. I'm beginning to understand that. Damon seems like a very wise man. He is. His spiritual insights have changed my life completely. I can see that. You sound so content, so centered. I am. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living according to God's purpose for my life. We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, bills, the house, the divorce proceedings. Tessa had already filed the paperwork and expected everything to be finalized within a few weeks. I know this is hard for you, she said before hanging up, but I want you to know how much I appreciate the way you're handling everything. A lot of men would be angry, vindictive. Your grace through this process shows what a good person you are. I just want you to be happy, Tessa. I am happy. Happier than I've ever been. After she hung up, I sat in our empty house and tried to reconcile the woman on the phone with the tired, thin figure I'd seen working in Damon's garden. Either she was putting on an act for my benefit, or the psychological manipulation was so complete that she genuinely believed she was happy despite obvious physical and emotional deterioration. Both possibilities were terrifying. The next morning, Damon called back with his decision about the compound visit. I've discussed your request with our leadership council, he said, and we've agreed that a brief visit might be beneficial for your spiritual development. However, there would need to be some conditions. Of course, whatever you think is appropriate. The visit would need to be scheduled for a specific time when it won't disrupt our regular activities. You'd be accompanied at all times by myself or another council member, and you'd need to agree to respect our privacy. No photos, no recordings, no sharing of details about our internal operations. I completely understand. When would work best? This Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock, the visit would last approximately 1 hour. That sounds perfect. Should I bring anything? The contribution I mentioned? That's not necessary for this visit. We can discuss financial matters at a later time. Great. I'll see you Saturday at 2. After hanging up, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I was finally going to see the inside of Damon's operation, but I'd also be walking into enemy territory with no backup and no way to communicate with the outside world. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I practiced with the digital recorder until I could operate it by touch, programmed emergency contacts into the prepaid phone, and made sure Mike knew exactly when and where I'd be. If you don't hear from me by 4 p.m. Saturday, I told him, call Sheriff Doyle and tell her to check the compound. Maybe I should just follow you out there. Stay in the woods with a pair of binoculars. No, if they spot you, it'll blow everything. Just stick to the plan. All right. But Julian, be careful. Guys like this Damon, they don't like being investigated. If he figures out what you're really doing, then I'll deal with that when it happens. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes everything look ominous. I dressed in my most harmless outfit, khakis, button-down shirt, windbreaker, and double-checked that the recorder was working properly. At 1:45 p.m., I drove through the compound's gates for the first time as an invited guest. Up close, the property was even more impressive than it had appeared from a distance. The main house was beautifully maintained, the gardens were immaculate, and everything had the kind of perfect order that suggested either divine blessing or obsessive control. Damon met me at the front door, wearing his usual warm smile and an outfit that managed to look both casual and authoritative. Julian, welcome. I'm so pleased you could join us. Thank you for making this possible. I know how important privacy is to your community. Come, let me show you around. I think you'll find our little sanctuary quite peaceful. As we walked through the compound, Damon provided a carefully scripted tour. He showed me the main house's common areas, living room, dining room, library, all decorated with religious artwork, and furnished in a style that suggested prosperity without ostentation. "This is where we gather for meals and evening discussions," he explained, gesturing toward the dining room. "Community is very important to our spiritual practice." "How many people live here full-time?" "Currently, we have 12 residents. 7 women and 5 men, all committed to serving God's purpose through our ministry." "And they all live here year-round?" "Most do, yes. Some, like Tessa, are still transitioning from their previous lives. But eventually, full-time residence becomes necessary for complete spiritual development." We moved through the house systematically, with Damon pointing out features that emphasized the community's prosperity and harmony. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, the bedrooms were modest but comfortable, and everywhere there were signs of the residents' devotion: religious books, inspirational artwork, carefully maintained prayer spaces. What struck me most was how quiet everything was. We encountered several of the residents during our tour, but they all seemed subdued, speaking in soft voices and avoiding direct eye contact. When Damon introduced me, they smiled politely but offered little conversation. "Everyone seems very peaceful," I observed. "That's the result of spiritual discipline and proper guidance. When people align their lives with God's will, they find a deep inner tranquility. It's impressive. I can see why Tessa feels so at home here." We stepped outside to tour the gardens and outbuildings. The vegetable plots I'd observed from the woods were even more extensive than I'd realized, covering several acres with the kind of systematic organization that suggested serious agricultural production. "Do you sell the produce?" I asked. "Some of it. The ministry needs to be financially self-sufficient. We also preserve much of what we grow for our own consumption." "Smart. And the residents do all the farming work themselves?" "Physical labor is part of our spiritual discipline. It keeps us connected to God's creation and provides practical skills." As we walked past one of the smaller buildings, I caught a glimpse through an open door of what appeared to be an office space. There were filing cabinets, a computer, and what looked like medical equipment on a table. "What's that building used for?" I asked. Damon smoothly stepped between me and the doorway. "Administrative offices, very boring stuff, bookkeeping, correspondence, regulatory compliance. I imagine running a place like this involves a lot of paperwork. More than you might expect. The government requires extensive documentation for religious organizations." We completed the tour at a small chapel that had been built behind the main house. It was simple but beautiful, with stained glass windows and wooden pews that could seat maybe 30 people. "This is where we hold our ceremonies," Damon explained. "Marriages, baptisms, other sacred rituals. It's lovely, very peaceful. Would you like to sit for a moment? Sometimes people find that quiet contemplation in a sacred space helps clarify their spiritual questions." We sat in the front pew, and Damon launched into what was clearly a practiced presentation about the ministry's beliefs and practices. He spoke about divine revelation, spiritual marriage, the importance of surrendering earthly attachments to serve God's higher purpose. I listened with apparent fascination, while the digital recorder in my pocket captured every word. This was exactly the kind of evidence I needed. Damon explaining his theology in his own words, demonstrating the manipulation techniques he used to justify breaking up marriages and exploiting vulnerable women. "I have to ask," I said during a pause in his monologue, "how do you handle the practical aspects of plural marriage? I mean, legally speaking?" "Legal marriage is a secular institution, Julian. What we practice here is spiritual union, blessed by God, but not necessarily recognized by earthly authorities. The important thing is divine approval, not government paperwork." "That makes sense. And the women, the wives, they're all comfortable with sharing their spiritual husband. When people truly understand God's plan, jealousy and possessiveness disappear. The wives support each other, celebrate each other's spiritual growth. It's a beautiful thing to witness." "I'm sure it is. And financially, how does that work? Do they all contribute equally to the household? Everyone contributes according to their ability. Some bring financial resources, others bring skills or labor. God provides for those who trust in His plan. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, with Damon apparently allowing me time to absorb the spiritual atmosphere. I used the opportunity to study the chapel more carefully, noting details that might be useful later. Finally, Damon stood. I think that completes our tour. Do you have any other questions about our community? Just one. When do you think Tessa will be ready to move here full-time? That depends on her spiritual development and the completion of her earthly obligations. The divorce, settling her affairs, preparing her heart for complete commitment to God's purpose. Perhaps another month or two. I want to make sure I don't do anything to interfere with that process. Your cooperation has been remarkable, Julian. Many men would be fighting this transition, creating obstacles and complications. Your spiritual maturity is truly admirable. As we walked back toward the main house, I saw Tessa coming out of one of the smaller buildings. She looked surprised to see me, but pleased. Julian, Damon didn't tell me you were visiting today. I wanted to see where you've been finding so much peace, I said, giving her a hug. She felt thinner than I remembered, more fragile. Isn't it wonderful? The community, the sense of purpose, everything I've been searching for. It's very impressive. I can see why you're so happy here. We talked for a few minutes about the tour, the property, her daily routine. Tessa seemed genuinely content, but there was something in her eyes that suggested exhaustion or strain. When Damon suggested it was time for me to leave, she didn't object. Thank you again for this opportunity, I told Damon as we reached my car. It's helped me understand so much about what Tessa is experiencing. I'm glad it was beneficial. Perhaps we can arrange another visit in the future, when you've had time to process what you've seen here. I'd like that. And I meant what I said about contributing to the ministry. This work you're doing, it's clearly important. We'll discuss that soon. Drive safely, Julian. As I drove away from the compound, I felt a mixture of triumph and unease. I'd successfully infiltrated Damon's operation, recorded his explanations of his methods, and observed the living conditions of his followers. But I'd also seen how completely he'd manipulated my wife and the other women, and how isolated they were from any outside influence. The evidence I'd gathered was compelling, but I wasn't sure it was enough to bring down his operation or rescue the women he was exploiting. And now that I'd been inside his world, I understood just how dangerous Marcus Trenner really was. He wasn't just stealing money or breaking up marriages. He was systematically destroying people's lives, rebuilding them according to his own twisted vision, and doing it all under the cover of religious authority. It was time to take the next step in my campaign against him. But first, I needed to figure out exactly what that step should be. The recording from my compound visit was everything I'd hoped for and more. Damon's own words, captured in crystal-clear digital audio, provided a roadmap of his manipulation techniques and illegal activities. He'd essentially confessed to running an unlicensed marriage counseling operation, exploiting vulnerable women for financial gain, and operating a religious organization without proper legal status. I spent Sunday transcribing the most damaging portions of the recording, creating a document that laid out his methods in his own words. Combined with the background research I'd already compiled on Marcus Trenner, it painted a clear picture of a systematic fraud operation disguised as spiritual ministry. Monday morning, I took everything back to Sheriff Doyle. "This is more substantial than what you brought me last week," she admitted, after reviewing the transcripts and documentation. "But I'm still not sure it rises to the level of criminal activity. He's operating under a false identity, running an unlicensed counseling practice, and systematically defrauding vulnerable women. How is that not criminal?" "The false identity thing is tricky. Technically, people can call themselves whatever they want, as long as they're not committing fraud with fake documents. The counseling issue would be a state licensing board matter, not criminal, And the financial stuff. She shrugged. Adults can give their money to whoever they want, even if it's a bad decision. What about the polygamy angle? He's not legally married to any of them except possibly one. The rest are just people living together and calling it marriage. Weird, but not illegal. I felt my frustration building. So there's nothing you can do? I didn't say that. What you've given me is enough to justify some official inquiries. I can contact the state licensing board about his counseling background, check with the IRS about the ministry's tax status, maybe have a conversation with him about proper business registration. That's something, I guess. It's a start. But Julian, I need you to be careful here. If this guy is as manipulative as you think, he's not going to appreciate government attention. And if he feels threatened, he might do something desperate. Exactly. Cults don't usually end quietly. They escalate, they relocate, or they implode. None of those options are good for the people trapped inside. I left the sheriff's office feeling like I was running out of time. Official investigations could take months, and by then Damon might have moved his operation or tightened his control over the women to the point where rescue became impossible. That afternoon, I decided to try a different approach. I drove to the county hospital and asked to speak with someone in the social services department. If Damon was exploiting vulnerable women, there might be resources available to help them even without criminal charges. The social worker I met with, a woman named Patricia Chen, listened to my story with the kind of professional attention that suggested she'd dealt with similar situations before. What you're describing sounds like a classic coercive control situation, she said. The isolation, the financial exploitation, the gradual erosion of individual decision-making. These are all red flags for psychological abuse. Is there anything you can do to help the women? Not directly, unless they ask for help, or we have evidence of immediate physical danger. But there are resources available if they ever decide to leave. Shelters, counseling services, legal assistance. The problem is getting them to recognize they need help. They all seem convinced they're following God's will. That's common in these situations. The manipulation is so gradual and complete that victims often can't recognize their own exploitation. Patricia gave me a stack of brochures about domestic violence resources and cult recovery services. If you ever get the chance to speak with any of the women privately, let them know these services exist. Sometimes just knowing there are options is enough to plant a seed of doubt. I thanked her and left with a new understanding of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just financial fraud or marriage counseling without a license. It was systematic psychological abuse designed to destroy people's ability to think independently or make autonomous decisions. That evening, Tessa called from the compound. She sounded more tired than usual, and there was a quality to her voice that suggested she might be getting sick. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "You sound a little under the weather." "Just tired. We've been working hard on a special project for the ministry." "What kind of project?" "I can't really discuss it. It's sensitive. But it's important work. Work that could help a lot of people." "That sounds meaningful. Are you getting enough rest?" "Rest isn't as important as serving God's purpose. Damon says that physical comfort is often a distraction from spiritual growth." "Even so, you need to take care of yourself. I worry about you." "You don't need to worry about me anymore, Julian. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." After she hung up, I sat staring at the phone for several minutes. The woman I'd just spoken with sounded nothing like the confident, spiritually fulfilled person she'd been presenting herself as for months. She sounded exhausted, possibly ill, and completely disconnected from her own physical needs. Something was happening at the compound, something Damon was calling a special project, and whatever it was taking a toll on the women involved. I decided it was time to escalate my investigation. If the authorities couldn't or wouldn't act on the evidence I'd already gathered, I needed to find something more compelling, something that would force them to take immediate action. Tuesday morning, I called Mike and asked him to meet me for lunch. We needed to discuss the next phase of my plan, and I needed backup for what I was considering. So let me get this straight, Mike said, after I'd explained my concerns about Tessa's deteriorating condition and Damon's mysterious special project. You want to sneak back onto the compound and figure out what they're doing? Not sneak. I'm going to ask for another visit, but this time, I want you positioned in the woods with binoculars and a cell phone. If something goes wrong, you call the sheriff immediately. What do you think could go wrong? I don't know, but Tessa sounded really bad last night, and Damon mentioned during my visit that she'd be ready to move to the compound full-time within a month or two. I'm worried he's planning to cut off her contact with the outside world completely. Okay, when do we do this? I'm going to call him this afternoon and ask for another visit, probably this weekend. And what exactly are you hoping to find? Evidence of what this special project is, documentation of the financial exploitation, proof that the women are being held against their will or subjected to abuse, something that will force the authorities to act. Mike nodded slowly. And if Damon refuses to let you visit again? Then I'll know he's getting suspicious and we'll have to try a different approach. What kind of different approach? I'd been thinking about that possibility. Direct intervention. Confronting Tessa when she's away from the compound, trying to deprogram her myself. It's riskier, but if the legal system won't protect her, I might not have a choice. Count me in either way. This guy needs to be stopped. That afternoon, I called Damon and requested another visit to the compound. I've been thinking a lot about what I saw last Saturday, I told him. It really helped clarify some things about my own spiritual journey. I was hoping we could meet again soon to discuss how I might become more involved with the ministry. I'm pleased to hear you're feeling called to deeper involvement, Julian. What kind of involvement did you have in mind? Well, the financial contribution I mentioned, obviously, but maybe something more than that. I feel like God might be calling me to make bigger changes in my life. There was a pause. What kind of changes? I'm not sure yet. That's why I'd like to visit again, to spend more time in that spiritual environment. Maybe talk with some of the other residents about their experiences. That might be possible. When were you thinking? This Saturday afternoon, if that works for you. Another pause, longer this time. Julian, I have to ask, what's prompted this sudden interest in deeper involvement? Last week you seemed focused on understanding Tessa's transition. Now you're talking about your own spiritual calling. I'd expected this question and had prepared an answer. Seeing the compound, talking with you about divine purpose, it made me realize how empty my life has become. My marriage is ending, my job feels meaningless, I don't have children or any real sense of purpose. Maybe God is using this situation to show me a different path. That's actually quite insightful, Julian. Many people who are called to our ministry come to us during times of transition and spiritual seeking. So you'll consider another visit? Yes, but I'd like to structure it a bit differently this time. Rather than just a tour, perhaps you could join us for our Saturday evening community gathering. It would give you a better sense of our spiritual practices and allow you to interact more naturally with our residents. That sounds perfect. What time should I arrive? 6 o'clock. The gathering runs from 6:30 to about 9, followed by a community meal. You'd be welcome to stay for the entire evening. Thank you, Damon. I really appreciate your openness to my spiritual exploration. God calls us to welcome seekers with open hearts. I look forward to seeing you Saturday. After hanging up, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. An evening gathering would give me much more access to the compound and its residents than a brief afternoon tour. But it would also mean spending 3 hours in Damon's territory, surrounded by his followers, with no easy way to leave if things went wrong. I called Mike and updated him on the plan. Saturday evening, 6 to 9. I need you in position by 5:30, and if you don't hear from me by 10 o'clock, call Sheriff Doyle. Got it. Anything else I should know? Yeah. If this goes sideways, don't try to be a hero. Call the professionals and let them handle it. Understood. But Julian, if this guy tries to hurt you, all bets are off. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The rest of the week crawled by with agonizing slowness. I spent my time researching cult intervention techniques, reviewing everything I knew about Damon's operation, and preparing for every scenario I could imagine. I also made some practical preparations. I updated my will, left sealed envelopes with Mike and Sheriff Doyle containing all my research and evidence, and made sure my life insurance was current. If something happened to me, I wanted to make sure the investigation would continue. Friday evening, Tessa called again. This time she sounded even worse. Her voice was hoarse, she seemed to have trouble concentrating, and she mentioned feeling dizzy and nauseous. Maybe you should see a doctor, I suggested. Damon says it's just spiritual purification. Sometimes the body rebels when the soul is being cleansed of earthly attachments. Tessa, that doesn't sound like spiritual purification. That sounds like you're sick. You don't understand. This is part of the process. The special project we're working on, it requires sacrifice, dedication. Physical discomfort is temporary, but spiritual growth is eternal. What is this special project? Maybe I can help. I can't discuss it with outsiders, but don't worry about me, Julian. I'm exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what God wants me to do. After she hung up, I stared at the phone with growing alarm. Tessa wasn't just tired or stressed, she sounded genuinely ill. And Damon was telling her that her symptoms were part of some spiritual process rather than encouraging her to seek medical attention. I had a terrible feeling that whatever was happening at the compound, it was escalating beyond psychological manipulation into something that could cause real physical harm. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. I needed to get inside that compound and find out what Damon's special project was before it was too late to save my wife and the other women he was exploiting. But first, I had to survive an evening in the heart of his operation, surrounded by his followers, with no backup except Mike, hidden in the woods with a cell phone. It was going to be the longest night of my life. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes Missouri beautiful and deceptive. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, the kind of night that should have been spent at a high school football game or backyard barbecue, not infiltrating a cult compound. I arrived at the compound gates at exactly 6 o'clock, wearing my most harmless outfit and carrying a digital recorder that I'd tested obsessively all week. Mike was already positioned in the woods with binoculars and a direct line to Sheriff Doyle. If I didn't check in by 10 p.m., the cavalry would arrive. Damon met me at the main house with his usual warm smile, but I noticed he seemed more alert than during my previous visit, his eyes scanning me carefully as we shook hands. Julian, welcome back. I'm excited for you to experience our community gathering. I think you'll find it very enlightening. Thank you for including me. I've been looking forward to this all week. He led me into the main house, which had been transformed since my last visit. The furniture in the large living room had been rearranged to create a circle of chairs, and the lighting had been dimmed to create what I supposed was meant to be a spiritual atmosphere. Religious music played softly from speakers I couldn't see. The residents were already assembled, sitting quietly in the circle with their hands folded and their eyes downcast. I recognized several faces from my previous visit, including Tessa, who looked even worse than she'd sounded on the phone. Her skin was pale, her eyes were sunken, and she seemed to be having trouble sitting upright. "Please, take a seat anywhere you'd like," Damon said, gesturing toward an empty chair. "We'll begin in just a few minutes." I chose a chair that gave me a clear view of the entire circle and activated the recorder in my pocket. Whatever was about to happen, I wanted it documented. As I settled into my chair, I counted the residents, 7 women and 4 men, plus Damon. The women all looked tired and unhealthy, while the men appeared more alert and robust. The gender disparity was striking and disturbing. "Friends," Damon began, his voice taking on the resonant quality of a practiced speaker, "we have a special guest with us tonight. Julian is Tessa's earthly husband, and he's been gracious enough to support her spiritual transition. He's also expressed interest in his own spiritual development, which is why I've invited him to join our gathering. Several residents nodded in acknowledgement, but none of them made eye contact with me. Their behavior reminded me of patients in a psychiatric ward, present but not fully engaged with their surroundings. Tonight, we're going to focus on the theme of sacrifice, Damon continued. Specifically, the sacrifices we make for divine purpose. As many of you know, we're approaching a crucial phase in our ministry's development, and that phase will require unprecedented commitment from all of us. He began walking around the circle as he spoke, occasionally placing his hands on residents' shoulders in what appeared to be a gesture of blessing or encouragement. Some of you have already made tremendous sacrifices. You've left behind earthly marriages, given up material possessions, surrendered your individual wills to serve God's greater plan. But God is calling us to go even further. I noticed that several of the women were swaying slightly in their chairs, as if they were having trouble staying conscious. Tessa was among them, her eyes glazed and unfocused. The special project I've been discussing with many of you represents the ultimate test of our faith. It requires us to trust God completely, even when His plan seems to conflict with our earthly understanding. Damon paused behind Tessa's chair and placed both hands on her shoulders. Some of you will be called to make the greatest sacrifice of all, the sacrifice of your earthly vessel in service of divine purpose. He was talking about human sacrifice, and he was looking directly at my wife as he said it. Of course, he continued with a slight smile, I'm speaking metaphorically. The dissolution of the ego, the surrender of worldly attachments. Though at times, God calls us to more direct demonstrations of our faith. For the next hour, Damon delivered what could only be described as a brainwashing session. He spoke about the worthlessness of individual desires, the importance of absolute obedience to divine authority, and the blessedness of those who were chosen for special service. Throughout his presentation, the residents sat motionless, occasionally murmuring agreement or raising their hands in response to his questions. What disturbed me most was how the women responded differently from the men. While the male residents seemed alert and engaged, the women appeared drugged or hypnotized. They moved slowly, spoke in whispers when called upon, and seemed to have difficulty focusing on anything for more than a few seconds. During a brief break in the presentation, I approached Tessa under the pretense of checking on her well-being. "How are you feeling?" I asked quietly. "You look tired." She turned to me with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. "I'm being prepared," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Damon says I'm almost ready for the final blessing." "What kind of blessing?" "The one that will make me perfect in God's eyes, the one that will let me serve His purpose completely." Before I could ask more questions, Damon called the group back to attention. "It's time for our communion ceremony," he announced. "Julian, as our guest, you'll observe rather than participate, but I think you'll find it very meaningful." One of the male residents brought out a tray containing small cups filled with what appeared to be wine or grape juice. Damon blessed the cups with an elaborate prayer, then handed them to each resident in turn. "Drink and be renewed in God's purpose," he intoned, as each person consumed the liquid. I watched carefully as the residents drank. Within minutes, the women became even more lethargic, while the men seemed unaffected. It was clear that the women's drinks contained some kind of sedative or psychoactive drug. The ceremony concluded with Damon delivering a final blessing over the assembled group. "Go now in peace, knowing that you serve God's highest purpose. Some of you will be called to special service very soon. When that call comes, receive it with joy and gratitude." As the residents filed out of the room, I noticed that the women needed assistance walking. The men helped guide them toward what I assumed were their sleeping quarters, supporting them like hospital orderlies helping patients. "What did you think of our gathering?" Damon asked as the room emptied. "It was very intense. I can see why it would be meaningful for people seeking spiritual direction. I'm glad you found it worthwhile. Would you like to stay for our community meal? It would give you a chance to interact more informally with our residents." "Actually, I was hoping I could speak with Tessa privately for a few minutes, just to see how she's adjusting to everything." Damon's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid that won't be possible tonight. The communion ceremony is very draining, and the women need to rest immediately afterward, perhaps during a future visit." "Of course, I understand. However, I would like to continue our conversation about your potential involvement with our ministry. Perhaps we could step outside for some fresh air?" I followed him out of the main house and into the compound's garden area. The night was quiet, except for the sound of insects and the distant hum of highway traffic. We walked slowly among the vegetable plots, while Damon spoke about the ministry's future plans and my possible role in them. "I sense that God is calling you to something significant, Julian. Your spiritual sensitivity, your willingness to support Tessa's transition, these are signs of divine favor. I appreciate your confidence in me. I've been feeling called to make major changes in my life." "What kind of changes?" "I'm not entirely sure yet, but watching Tessa find such peace and purpose here, it makes me realize how empty my own life has become." We paused near one of the outbuildings I'd noticed during my previous visit. Through a partially open door, I could see what appeared to be medical equipment, an examination table, IV stands, and cabinets that might contain pharmaceutical supplies. "What's that building used for?" I asked. "Medical facilities. We believe in caring for our residents' physical needs, as well as their spiritual development." "Do you have a doctor on staff?" "I have some medical training myself. Nothing formal, but enough to handle basic health issues." As we continued walking, Damon began probing more directly about my intentions and resources. He asked about my job, my financial situation, my family connections, and my long-term plans. It felt like an interview, as if he were evaluating me as a potential addition to his collection. "The financial contribution you mentioned," he said eventually. "Have you given more thought to the amount and timing?" "I have the $15,000 I mentioned, but I've been wondering if God might be calling me to contribute more than just money." "What else did you have in mind?" "My skills, my labor, maybe even my full-time commitment. I don't have children or significant family obligations. If God is calling me to serve His purpose through your ministry, that's a significant decision, Julian, not one to be made lightly." "I understand, but I feel like I'm being called to something greater than my current life offers." We completed our circuit of the compound and returned to the main house. Most of the lights were now off, and the property had settled into nighttime quiet. "I should probably head home," I said. "But I want to thank you for including me tonight. It's given me a lot to think about." "I'm glad it was meaningful for you. Let's plan to meet again soon to discuss your spiritual development in more detail." "I'd like that. And Damon, please take care of Tessa. I know she's in good hands, but she seemed very tired tonight." "Tessa is exactly where she needs to be, receiving exactly the guidance she needs. Don't worry about her physical comfort. Spiritual growth sometimes requires temporary earthly discomfort." As I drove away from the compound, my mind raced with everything I'd observed. The drugged communion ceremony, the medical facility, Damon's comments about sacrifice and special service. It all pointed towards something far more sinister than financial fraud or psychological manipulation. I was convinced that Damon was planning to physically harm the women in his care, possibly under the guise of some twisted religious ritual. And Tessa, based on his comments about her being almost ready, was likely his next target. I drove straight to Sheriff Doyle's house, knowing that what I'd witnessed constituted enough evidence to justify immediate intervention. The drugging alone was grounds for multiple felony charges, and the medical facility suggested he might be planning something even worse. Maggie listened to my account with growing alarm, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification about specific details. "This is definitely enough for search and arrest warrants," she said when I finished. "The drugging, the unlicensed medical practice, the false identity, we can move on this immediately." "How soon?" "I can have warrants by morning and execute them Sunday afternoon. But Julian, I need you to stay away from the compound until this is over. If Damon suspects you're working with law enforcement, I understand. Just please get those women out of there before it's too late." Sunday morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. I stayed home, pacing and checking my phone obsessively, waiting for word from Sheriff Doyle. Mike came by around noon with coffee and moral support, but neither of us could focus on anything except what was happening at the compound. At 2:30 p.m., my phone finally rang. "We got him," Maggie said without preamble. "Damon Vossel, a.k.a. Marcus Trenner, is in custody, along with his 4 male accomplices. The women are being transported to the hospital for medical evaluation." "What about Tessa? Is she okay?" "She's alive, but she's in rough shape. They all are. It looks like they've been systematically drugged and malnourished for months. The doctors say it's going to take time to get the chemicals out of their systems and assess the full extent of the damage." "What was he planning to do to them?" "We're still sorting through the evidence, but it seems he was planning some sort of mass tragedy. We found detailed plans, enough drugs to harm dozens of people, and what looks like a ceremonial setup in one of the outbuildings." I felt my knees give out and had to sit down on my kitchen floor. "When?" "Based on the timeline we found, probably within the next week or two. You may have saved their lives by coming forward when you did." The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews, media attention, and hospital visits. The story of the Divine Path Ministries cult made national news, with reporters descending on our small town to cover the dramatic rescue and arrest of Marcus Trenner. Tessa spent a week in the hospital while doctors worked to clear the drugs from her system and address the malnutrition and dehydration that had resulted from months of abuse. When she was finally coherent enough for conversation, I was amazed by how quickly her personality began to return. "I can't believe I fell for it," she said during one of my visits, tears streaming down her face. "Everything he told us, all the spiritual guidance, it was all lies designed to control us." "He's a professional manipulator, Tessa. He knew exactly how to target your vulnerabilities and exploit them. None of this was your fault." "But our marriage, our savings, all the terrible things I said to you? We'll figure it out. The important thing is that you're safe now." The investigation revealed the full scope of Marcus Trenner's operation. He'd been running similar schemes for over a decade, moving from state to state and targeting vulnerable women with his fake religious ministry. The compound had been his most ambitious project, designed as a long-term facility where he could completely control his victims' lives. The medical evidence was particularly disturbing. The women had been systematically poisoned with a combination of sedatives and psychoactive drugs that made them compliant and dependent while gradually destroying their physical health. The special project Tessa had mentioned was actually preparation for a mass suicide event that would have eliminated the evidence of his crimes while allowing him to escape with their remaining assets. Marcus Trenner was ultimately sentenced to life in prison on charges including kidnapping, assault, fraud, and attempted murder. His male accomplices received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. The compound was seized by the government and eventually sold, with the proceeds going to victim compensation. Tessa and I divorced as planned, but it was an amicable process focused on helping both of us heal from the trauma of the past year. She entered intensive therapy to address the psychological damage from her time in the cult, while I worked with a counselor to process my own anger and guilt about not recognizing the danger sooner. 6 months later, I received a call from Patricia Chen, the social worker I'd spoken with during my investigation. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that 3 more women have come forward with information about Marcus Trenner's previous operations. Your willingness to speak up has helped us identify other victims and build cases against his accomplices in other states. I'm glad something good came out of all this. More than you know. The techniques you used to gather evidence, the way you worked with law enforcement. We're using your case as a model for training other family members who suspect their loved ones are involved in cult situations. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for when this whole nightmare began. My marriage was over, our savings were gone, and the woman I'd loved for 8 years was struggling to rebuild her identity after months of systematic abuse. But Tessa was alive, Marcus Trenner was in prison, and other potential victims might be spared the same fate. Sometimes, I suppose, that's the best you can hope for. Not a happy ending, but a just one. Not a restoration of what was lost, but a prevention of what could have been much worse. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone in my house, I allow myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that's enough.